My sister's wedding rehearsal dinner had 70 guests, white tablecloths, and a view of the Chicago skyline that my father had paid $11,000 for. And somewhere between the champagne toast and the salmon course, he looked across that beautiful room at me and my boyfriend and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "So, still playing house with the handyman?" I smiled at the centerpiece. I did not cry. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that the man sitting next to me, the one my father had just called a handyman, was about to be recognized by the most powerful person in that room. And when it happened, the whole table went so quiet you could hear the ice shifting in the water glasses. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Meg. I'm 29 years old. I teach 4th grade at a public elementary school in Evanston, Illinois, and I have done so for 5 years. I love my job. I love the kids. I love the craft projects and the read-alouds, and the way a child's face looks when something clicks. When the math problem finally makes sense, when they finish their first chapter book and look up at you like they've just climbed Everest. My family does not love my job. My father is a partner at a corporate law firm downtown. My mother left her own career in finance when my sister and I were born, but she never stopped thinking in terms of performance reviews and quarterly earnings. My sister Brooke followed the expected path, pre-law at Northwestern, law school at Georgetown, now an associate at a firm that my father describes, without irony, as respectable. I was supposed to also the same path. I had the grades. I had the LSAT prep books stacked on my desk junior year of college. And then I did a semester of student teaching as an elective, almost by accident, and everything changed. I tried to explain it to my parents. The calling of it. The way it felt like the first thing I'd ever done that was entirely mine. My father said, "Meg, teachers don't make money." My mother said, "You can always tutor on the side." That was 5 years ago. They haven't fully accepted it since. I met Finn at a hardware store, which I now recognize is the kind of detail that sounds made up but isn't. I was trying to find the right sandpaper grit to refinish a thrift store dresser. He was standing in the same aisle, looking at wood stain, and he asked me what I was working on, and we talked for 45 minutes before I remembered I was supposed to be somewhere. He was straightforward about what he did. He said he worked in construction and renovation. He said he grew up building things with his grandfather and never stopped. He had calluses on his hands and a truck that was always slightly dusty. And he never once tried to make himself sound more impressive than he was. I didn't ask for more details than that, and he didn't offer them. It didn't matter to me. He showed up when he said he would. He listened when I talked about my students. He drove 40 minutes to sit in the back row at my school's winter concert because I mentioned, once, that I always felt a little lonely at those things. We'd been together 14 months when my sister got engaged. Brooke's fiancé is named Christopher. He's fine. He's perfectly fine. He went to Duke. He works in finance. He has opinions about craft beer and very little else. My parents adore him. My father shook his hand at their first meeting and said, "Now there's a young man who knows where he's going." I smiled. Finn squeezed my hand under the table. The rehearsal dinner was held at a restaurant on the 42nd floor of a building in the Loop. My parents had rented out the private dining room. Brooke had a dress that cost more than my monthly rent. Everything was perfect and curated and designed to signal, quietly and expensively, that this family had made it. Finn wore a dark navy suit he'd bought that week. He looked good. He looked genuinely, quietly handsome. He pulled out my chair. He learned the names of everyone at the table within the first 10 minutes. He asked my grandmother about her garden, and she talked to him for 20 straight minutes and left the conversation glowing. My father watched all of this with the particular expression he reserves for things he finds confusing and slightly irritating. The toast happened about 40 minutes in. My father stood up with his champagne glass and he talked about Brooke. He talked about her work ethic and her accomplishments and how proud he was. He talked about Christopher's family and their long history in Chicago. He talked about what a future they were building together. Then he turned to the table generally and said, "We've always pushed our girls to aim high, to surround themselves with people who match their ambition." He looked at Finn. Just for a second. Just long enough. Then he said, "Though I suppose ambition means different things to different people." Light laughter from a few of the guests who didn't catch it. My mother touched her pearl earring and looked at the window. Finn didn't move. He had his hand resting on the table, and he didn't move it, and he didn't change his expression. He just listened like my father was saying something perfectly ordinary. I looked at my plate. Later, during the salmon course, my father leaned across toward Finn and said, conversationally, like he was asking about the weather, "So, still playing house with the handyman?" There it was. Brooke made a small noise. Christopher picked up his fork. Finn said, "The salmon's good. Did you choose the restaurant? Or did the kids?" My father blinked. He hadn't expected that. I pressed my foot against Finn's under the table. The man who changed everything was sitting at the far end of our table. His name was Richard Hartwell. He was Christopher's uncle. Not the father, but the uncle who had flown in from Seattle, and who Christopher had mentioned, vaguely, worked in real estate development. I'd been introduced to him briefly when we arrived. He shook my hand, shook Finn's hand, and then did something I noticed but didn't understand at the time. He paused. He looked at Finn more carefully. He started to say something, then seemed to decide against it, and moved on to greet the next person. I'd forgotten about it entirely by the time the entrees arrived. It was during dessert that it happened. The table had softened into the loose, slightly wine-blurred conversation of a dinner winding down. My father was telling a story about a case he'd won in 2019 that he tells at every family gathering. Christopher's mother was asking Brooke about honeymoon plans. Richard Hartwell set down his dessert fork. He looked down the length of the table at Finn. He said, "I'm sorry, I have to ask. Are you Finnegan Holt?" The table didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a wave, one person at a time, as they registered that something was happening. Finn looked at him calmly and said, "I am." Richard leaned back in his chair like a man who had just placed a bet and watched it pay off. He said, "I thought so. I almost didn't recognize you without the hard hat." He laughed, just to himself. "We were at the groundbreaking together, the Meridian project, 2 years ago." Brooke's mother-in-law-to-be said, "The Meridian? In Seattle? Mixed-use tower," Richard said. 41 floors, about 300 million in development. He said it the way people say enormous numbers when they want them to land. Finnegan's firm was the primary contractor. Best structural work I've seen in 20 years. We ended up partnering on 2 more projects after that. The table was completely silent. My father had his champagne glass raised about halfway to his mouth. He didn't finish the motion. My mother turned to look at Finn as though she was seeing him for the first time, which in every way that mattered she was. Finn said, "The Meridian came out beautifully. Your team was great to work with." Richard said, "Your company's doing the harbor renovation now, right? I read about it in the journal last spring." "We broke ground in April," Finn said. "Here is what I learned that night, sitting at a table that had gone from dismissive to stunned in the space of about 90 seconds. Finn's full name is Finnegan Holt. He is the founder and principal of Holt Construction Group, which he started at 26 with a business partner and a single renovations contract in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. He now runs a company with over 200 employees. They do commercial and residential projects across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. The harbor renovation Richard mentioned is a City of Chicago project worth. I found this out later from a Tribune article. Brooke texted me at midnight. Somewhere north of $80 million. He told me he worked in construction. He told me he built things. He was not lying about a single word. I found out he'd never mentioned the scale of it because, as he explained to me later that night on the drive home, he'd spent most of his adult life watching people treat him differently the moment they knew. Potential friends who became networking opportunities, dates who stopped seeing him and started seeing a balance sheet. He said he'd wanted to find out who I was before he showed me who he was. "And?" I said. "And you drove 45 minutes to visit your student's family in the hospital during your spring break," he said. "You didn't mention it to me until 3 weeks later." I didn't say anything. "I knew pretty early," he said. The drive home from the rehearsal dinner was quiet. Not a bad quiet, a processing quiet. My phone started buzzing around 11. My mother, I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 11:15. I let that one go too. The voicemail said, Meg, your father and I had no idea. I mean, we knew Finn was, we knew he worked hard, we'd love to have you both for dinner. Soon. Just the four of us. Call me back, sweetheart. I listened to it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Here is what I want to say about that moment, because I think it matters. I was not happy. Not the way I should have been. I had just watched the two people who spent 5 years implying I'd made a mistake. With my career, with my choices, with Finn. Scramble to rewrite the entire story in the space of a dessert course. And the only reason they were doing it was because a man they'd never met had said a number with a lot of zeros in it. Not because Finn is kind. Not because he is patient and funny and relentlessly decent. Not because he drove 40 minutes to sit in the back row of a school winter concert. Not because when my father called him a handyman to his face at a family dinner, he responded by complimenting the fish. None of that mattered until the money did. I lay in the dark thinking about that for a long time. I called my mother back 3 days later. I said, I want to have dinner. But I need to say something first. She said, Of course, honey. I said, Finn's money doesn't change how you should have treated him, and it doesn't change how you treated me. I've been teaching for 5 years and you've never once asked me about my students. You've never asked what I love about the job. You asked me once, at Christmas 2 years ago, if I'd thought about going back to school for something more practical. I paused. I just want you to know that I remember. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're right, I know you're right, it wasn't enough. But it was a start. My father was harder. He's a man who has built his entire identity on being the smartest person in the room. And that night at the restaurant had dented something in him that I think will take a long time to repair. Not because he was embarrassed in front of people, but because he realized he'd gotten something fundamentally wrong about his own daughter and the life she was building. That's a different kind of wound. He called me on a Tuesday morning, which is when he calls when it's serious. He said, I owe you an apology. Several, probably. I said, yeah, you do. He said he was working on it. I said I was willing to let him. The wedding was 6 weeks later. Finn and I sat at a table with Christopher's cousins, who were all under 35 and delightful, and we danced for 2 solid hours and ate an unreasonable amount of the dessert station. My grandmother found us on the dance floor and danced with Finn to an old Sinatra song, and afterward told me privately that she'd liked him from the first moment. I know, I said. Your father will come around, she said. I know that too. My father did not make a toast that night. Brooke had asked him to keep it short and warm, and he did. He talked about Brooke's laugh and about how much he loved her and how happy Christopher made her. It was a good toast. I watched his face while he gave it and thought, there is a version of this man who could have been easier to be his daughter. I don't know what got in the way. I think it was fear. I think people who build their worth out of credentials and titles are afraid, at some very fundamental level, of what it means to love someone who doesn't need those things to matter. I think my father looked at me my whole life and saw someone who wasn't afraid of that, and he didn't know what to do with it. I don't fully forgive him, but I understand him a little better now. A few months after the wedding, I was telling one of my 4th graders, a kid named Marcus, who wants to be an architect, about how buildings get made. The permits, the planning, the people who do the actual work of making something out of nothing. He asked me how I knew so much about it. I told him my boyfriend builds them. Like small buildings? He said. Like big ones, I said, 40 floors sometimes. His eyes went enormous. Does he like it? I thought about Finn the way he is when he talks about a project, the specific look he gets, the way he uses his hands. He loves it, I said. He built his first thing, when he was 8 years old, with his grandpa. A little wooden bench. He still has it. Marcus thought about this for a moment. Then he said, My dad says what matters is if you're good at it and if it helps people. I said, Your dad sounds pretty smart. He shrugged the way only a 9-year-old can shrug. Like wisdom is obvious, and the adults are the ones who keep complicating it. Maybe he's right. I went home that evening and Finn was already there, making dinner, flour on his sleeve from the bread he'd decided to bake from scratch. Because that's the kind of person he is. He looked up when I walked in and smiled, and I thought, this is the life I chose. Not despite everything. Because of it. My parents are trying. I'm letting them. Some days it's easier than others. But I go to work every morning and I stand in front of 23 kids who are learning to read and multiply and understand the world. And I know, the way you know things that don't need defending, that I am exactly where I am supposed to be. That's not something a 41-floor building can give you. But it's not something a dinner table can take away, either.